The shattered glass door crunched beneath my feet, a sound like 1,000 tiny needles piercing the fragile silence of my home. A jagged cut on my forearm bled sluggishly, a dull throbbing that was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. Marcus's words, his harsh declaration of my worthlessness, hung in the silent air like a foul-smelling fog. My son, the boy I had cherished and raised, stood with his wife, Sarah. A smirk played on his lips, a cold, calculating glint in his eyes that was mirrored in hers. They watched my pain, a silent celebration of a victory I couldn't comprehend. The final, brutal blow had been delivered. They thought they had finally won. For so many years, I had walked a careful line. Since my husband, George, passed away, the house had become a mausoleum of memories, and my life, a quiet, orderly procession of days spent in the rose garden and the study. George's death had left a hole that was impossible to fill, and in my grief, I had clung to the hope that my son Marcus would be the one to help me through it. I saw his ambition, his hunger for wealth, but I had convinced myself it was a phase, a youthful arrogance that would fade with maturity. I believed in the good I thought was still in him. I held on to the memory of a little boy who would bring me dandelions from the yard and tell me I was the most beautiful woman in the world. I held on to that memory until it became a fragile, transparent lie, a ghost in the house that had been his home. The past few months had been a slow-motion descent. The constant demands for loans that were never repaid, the subtle shifts in conversation where they would steer every topic back to my finances, the way they would speak about my home as if it were already theirs. I had seen the signs, but I had refused to believe what they meant. I had always believed that blood was thicker than water, that family was an unbreakable bond forged in love and respect. But as I stood there, looking at the celebration in their eyes, I finally understood the truth. They had seen me not as a mother, but as an obstacle. My existence was a barrier between them and the wealth they believed they deserved. My shattered arm throbbed, but the pain felt a world away, a distant hum beneath the cold, hard clarity that had just set in. I knew what I had to do. I needed to get to my estate manager's office, not a hospital. My body was broken, but my mind was not. I was done being the passive victim. My neighbor and dear friend, Clara, found me moments later, her face a mask of horror. "My God, Evelyn, your arm. We have to get you to the hospital," she insisted, her hands fluttering over the wound. I just shook my head, my voice quiet but firm. "No, Clara, just drive me to Mr. Albright's office, please." She looked at me, perplexed and worried, but she saw something in my eyes that told her not to argue. The drive was silent, filled only with the faint sound of my steady breathing and the constant thrum of the pain in my arm. I thought about George. I thought about the many evenings we had spent in his study, going over the legal documents of his estate. He had been a shrewd businessman and a loving husband who had seen the world for what it was. He had loved Marcus, yes, but he had never been blind to the boy's weaknesses. His trust fund had been a masterpiece of legal architecture, a protective measure he had insisted on, knowing his son's tendencies better than I had. He had told me once, "Evelyn, this isn't for me, or even for you. It's to protect my legacy, and more importantly, to protect you from the very people you love." His words, once a vague comfort, were now a terrifying prophecy. As Clara drove, I reflected on my own life, on the careful structure I had built around myself. My roses, my books, my quiet routines, they had all been a shield, a way to keep the chaos of the outside world at bay. But the chaos had found its way inside, wearing the face of my own son. George had seen this coming, and he had given me the tools to fight back. I had been too afraid to use them, too afraid to admit that the love I held for my son was a one-way street. But now, with the sting of his betrayal still fresh, and the physical ache in my arm a constant reminder, my fear had curdled into a cold, hard resolve. I wouldn't just survive. I would make sure they understood what they had done. I had been quiet for too long, a gentle woman in a world of wolves. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness, and they were about to learn the difference. When we arrived at Mr. Albright's office, he was shocked to see me in such a state. "Evelyn, what on earth?" he started, but I cut him off. "Just get out the trust fund documents, John," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I need you to activate every last clause." The look on his face was one of dawning comprehension. He knew what that meant, and he knew why I was there. He pulled out the thick file, and I saw a roadmap for my future, a way to carry myself through this hell and still serve justice. I realized in that moment that I wasn't alone. I had George's foresight, Mr. Albright's expertise, and the quiet resolve that had been building inside me all these years. This wasn't just about reclaiming my money. It was about reclaiming myself. And for the first time since George's passing, I felt a flicker of hope, not for a reunion with my family, but for my own peace. Heartbreak Part 4, The Twist. After the shock of my initial wound and the quiet resolve that had settled over me, the pain in my arm felt less like an injury and more like a badge. I left Mr. Albright's office not with a bandage, but with a plan. My lawyer's face, a steady and focused concern, had hardened into a professional mask as he took down my instructions. He was to immediately activate the ironclad clauses of George's trust fund, the ones that gave me sole and total control. I didn't want to talk about Marcus and Sarah. I didn't want to explain the broken glass or the bleeding arm. I just wanted to move, to act. I wanted to turn this cold, quiet rage into something tangible, something they would feel. While I was doing this, Marcus and Sarah, blissfully ignorant, were celebrating. Clara, bless her heart, had taken me back to her house, but not before she peeked in my window to check on the vultures nesting in my home. She saw them clinking glasses in the kitchen, toasting their imagined victory. The image of their smiling faces, believing they had finally broken me, was a fuel of its own. I went to Clara's guest room, my arm still throbbing, and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. I just sat, still and silent, and waited. It didn't take long. Just as they were raising their glasses for another toast, the phone rang. It was the bank, and the sound of Sarah's shrill, panicked voice was like music to my ears, even from a distance. The celebration stopped dead. Their smiles evaporated. They had just been informed that all their assets were now frozen. All the funds they had carefully drained from my accounts, all the money they had believed was theirs to spend, gone. A look of sheer, unadulterated panic must have crossed their faces, and I felt a dark, satisfying wave of triumph wash over me. From Clara's house, I watched them through the window. Marcus, his face now pale, was frantically calling everyone he knew, a frantic, desperate energy radiating from him, even from across the lawn. The house, which had been filled with their loud, triumphant laughter just moments before, was now a place of silent, frantic chaos. They were scrambling, trying to figure out what was happening, who was behind the sudden freeze. They blamed everyone but themselves. They blamed the bank, their own lawyers, and even some distant relative who had once crossed them. They thought I was a broken, helpless woman with a shattered arm. They had no idea that I had just become a general, directing a war from a borrowed room, armed with nothing but my late husband's foresight and my own quiet resolve. They had wanted me to be useless and broke, but the truth was, their actions had just made them that way. The house that had been my sanctuary was now a cage, a place I had no intention of returning to just yet. The sudden financial freeze on Marcus and Sarah's assets had shattered their false sense of security, and I knew that a cornered animal was a dangerous one. So the next morning I remained at Clara's house, a subtle, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips as I sipped my coffee. I wasn't just safe here, I was in a position of power. I was a spectator to their unraveling, and it was a quiet sort of victory I hadn't known I needed. From the window of Clara's cozy kitchen, I watched the distant, frantic activity at my old home. The blinds would snap open and closed. The front door would fly open, and either Marcus or Sarah would rush out, cell phone pressed to their ear, their faces a frantic mix of anger and disbelief. It was a macabre puppet show, and I, for the first time in a long time, was holding the strings. My mind, so clouded by grief and a naive hope, was now clear. I had been a gentlewoman, yes, But George's trust had given me a weapon, and their betrayal had given me the will to use it. The phone at my old house must have been ringing off the hook all morning. Marcus and Sarah were frantically calling everyone they knew, trying to figure out what was happening. I could imagine the conversations. It's a mistake, a clerical error. We're being targeted. They were desperate, and in their desperation, they were a roadmap of what not to be. They had chosen money over family, greed over love, and now, without either, they were adrift. They had banked on my passivity, on my quiet nature. They had mistaken my sorrow for weakness. Now, they were learning that quiet doesn't mean weak. Clara, sitting across from me, poured herself a cup of coffee and simply looked at me, a silent, knowing look on her face. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. She just offered me her home, her quiet companionship, and the unspoken understanding that I needed time and space to navigate this storm. Her presence was a comfort I didn't know I had. In a world where my own family had betrayed me, this old friend had become my anchor. I realized then that I wasn't alone, and for a woman who had spent years caring for others, it was an empowering, humbling realization. I was no longer a widow in a grieving home. I was a woman on a mission, and the first shot had been fired. They had broken a glass door, but I had just broken their world. The silence at Clara's house was a welcome balm. I spent the day going through old photo albums with her, an activity that was both a comfort and a quiet torture. Flipping through the pages, I saw a timeline of my life, a history of love, and, as I now realized, a history of willful blindness. There was a picture of George and me on our wedding day, his smile so full of hope and a protective kind of love. There were pictures of a young Marcus, a mischievous grin on his face, holding up a fish he had caught with his father. I could see the love there, and the way George's arm was around his son's shoulders, and the pride on my face. But I could also see the emotional distance growing, the subtle shifts that I had chosen to ignore. In one photo, a teenage Marcus was holding a new car key, a gift from his father. His eyes weren't on us, but on the car itself, a glimmer of greed that I had mistaken for ambition. I had always believed in the good I thought was still in him, but this physical act of betrayal, the broken glass, the bleeding arm, was just a painful manifestation of what I had long ignored. It was the culmination of years of quiet neglect and a growing sense of entitlement that had warped my son into a stranger. George had seen it, and he had tried to protect me from it. My mistake was in believing that a mother's love could be a cure for a son's greed. Clara didn't say much, just a gentle squeeze of my hand every now and then. Her silence was a profound comfort. I didn't need to explain myself to her. She knew. She had seen the way Marcus had changed, the way Sarah had fueled his worst impulses. The betrayal wasn't just in their actions, but in the slow, creeping realization that the son I had mourned for was a ghost, a memory of a boy who no longer existed. I had been grieving for two people, my husband and the son I thought I had. Now the grief for one was gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus. I was no longer an old woman in mourning. I was a woman who was done being used. I had a purpose now, a roadmap born from George's love and their own terrible greed. And the journey was just beginning. Staying at Clara's house had become my new normal, a quiet refuge from the emotional storm at my own home. I was no longer a resident in my house, but an observer. The anger that had first fueled my actions had now settled into a cold, hard purpose. From Clara's guest room, I began making quiet calls. I had another daughter, my kind, gentle Anna, who lived abroad. I had been hesitant to involve her, to taint her peaceful life with the ugliness of her brother's greed, but she had a right to know. And then there was my nephew Tom, a lawyer who had always been the black sheep of the family for his unwavering honesty. I made the calls, my voice a quiet monotone as I recounted the events, the shattered glass, the bleeding arm, the freezing of Marcus and Sarah's assets. I didn't editorialize, I just stated the facts, and in doing so, the truth was even more damning. Anna was heartbroken, and Tom was furious. He immediately offered his legal expertise, a resource I gratefully accepted. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was family, and his help felt like a small, comforting victory in a war of attrition. Meanwhile, back at the house, Marcus and Sarah were spiraling. Their panic was a tangible thing, a dark cloud that hung over the home. They were now openly accusing everyone from the neighbors to the family lawyer of trying to destroy them. It was a pathetic show of desperation, a last-ditch effort to deflect blame from their own terrible actions. I was no longer a mother grieving for a son, but a strategist, watching my opponents from a distance as they fell apart. They were so busy looking for an enemy on the outside, they couldn't see that their greatest enemy was their own greed, a monster that had now turned on them. I was quiet, but I was not weak. I was simply preparing for my next move. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a sense of control, a feeling of empowerment that was 1,000 times more valuable than any money they could have stolen. My days at Clara's house were a study in calculated patience. I found a strange kind of peace in the quiet, in the knowledge that I was orchestrating a slow, methodical unraveling of my son's life. The phone calls to Anna and Tom had cemented my position. I was not just a victim, but the head of a new kind of family, one built on honesty and respect rather than blood. I was no longer grieving. I was healing. My mind was sharp. My resolve was firm, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose beyond the confines of my rose garden. But a vengeful heart, even one that is just, knows no peace. The next morning, a call from a neighbor shattered the fragile calm. They had heard a commotion at the house. A neighbor, an old friend who had known me for years, called and, in a hushed, horrified voice, told me that Marcus and Sarah had broken in. They were looking for something, a hidden will, a document, anything that might reverse their misfortune. My stomach turned, not from fear, but from a cold, righteous anger. The betrayal had gone from emotional to physical, from a broken heart to a ransacked home. My sanctuary, the place where I had raised my children and found a quiet peace with my husband, had been violated. I drove over to the house, my heart thumping a steady, cold rhythm against my ribs. I pulled up to the curb, a silent observer to the crime scene. The front door was splintered, a gruesome testament to their desperation. I walked around the side of the house, my gaze falling on the shattered glass of my study window, the very window I had spent countless hours gazing out of while I tended to the finances. It was a mirror of the front door, another testament to their frantic, mindless rage. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I knew what I would find. They had ransacked the place, searching for a hidden document, a secret key, anything that might give them back what they believed was theirs. But they had found nothing. They hadn't ransacked the house for money or valuables. They had done it out of spite and desperation, a last-ditch effort to prove that their entitlement was justified. And in doing so, they had given me exactly what I needed, a tangible list of grievances, a clear and undeniable case against them. They thought they were taking revenge on me, but they were only digging their own graves. I had just been handed the ammunition I needed. My son had just gone from being a disappointment to being a criminal, and there was nothing I could do but watch him fall. The sun had just begun to set, casting long, menacing shadows across my lawn as I stood there, a silent witness to their fury. The broken window, the splintered door, it wasn't just a sign of their rage, but of their desperation. They had been searching for something, a document, a loophole, anything to undo the cold, hard fact of their frozen assets. But George's trust was a fortress, and I was its last, quiet defender. They had found nothing, and in their frustration, they had only succeeded in adding to my list of grievances against them. I didn't feel anger. I felt a chilling calm. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I simply called the police from my car, my voice a steady monotone as I reported a break-in. I gave them the details, the broken door, the ransacked house, the missing items. I didn't name my son and his wife. I didn't need to. The police would figure it out soon enough. And then I called a locksmith and an alarm company. I arranged for new locks to be installed and a state-of-the-art security system to be put in place, all from the comfort of my car. My home was no longer a place of refuge. It was a crime scene, a testament to the lengths my son would go to get what he wanted. As I sat there, watching the locksmith work, a new idea began to form in my mind. I had a lot of assets, a lot of physical property that held no sentimental value to me. I had a small vacation home in the countryside that George and I had bought on a whim. I had a boat we had used once or twice. These were things they coveted, things they believed they were entitled to. But I was no longer a gentlewoman. I was a strategist. I started making quiet calls to my lawyer, instructing him to begin the process of selling off these less sentimental assets. The money, I instructed, was to be converted into untraceable cash. My son and his wife were looking for a tangible weakness, a document they could use against me, but they were looking in the wrong place. My strength wasn't in my wealth, it was in my resolve. They had wanted to make me broke and useless, but in their haste, they had only succeeded in giving me the motivation to become cold, ruthless, and efficient. I was a woman who had spent a lifetime building a fortress of love and trust, and now, with that fortress in ruins, I was building a new one made of steel and cold, hard logic. And as I watched the locksmith finish his work, I knew that my son and his wife had just sealed their own fate. They were about to learn that quiet doesn't mean weak, it just means you're watching, waiting, and preparing your next move. The cold efficiency of my revenge was a strange kind of comfort. My home was now secure, protected by new locks and a silent alarm system, and I had taken the first steps toward liquefying my assets. I was no longer a victim, I was a tactician. The pain in my arm had faded, leaving behind a dull ache that served as a constant reminder of the price of my quiet trust. I wasn't just getting my revenge, I was also rebuilding myself, brick by brick, into something stronger, colder, and far more powerful than I had ever been. From Clara's house, I made my next move. I began to strategically donate large sums of money from my now unfrozen personal accounts. A significant sum went to a local women's shelter, another to the children's hospital where George had spent his final days. I didn't do it for praise or for public acknowledgement. I did it because it felt right, because my wealth was a tool, not a chain. It was a way to give my money a purpose beyond simply funding my son's and his wife's extravagant lifestyle. But of course, their network of informants, friends, distant relatives, and acquaintances who had long seen me as a mere bank account got word of my donations. The phone calls started, a new round of panicked, angry accusations. Marcus and Sarah were tipped off, and they seized on it as a new angle for their public campaign. They tried to publicly shame me, accusing me of squandering their family inheritance, of being an unhinged old woman who was throwing away their birthright. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They, who had tried to steal everything from me, were now trying to paint me as the villain. But their words had no sting. I was no longer the heartbroken mother they had once known. I was a woman who had seen the true face of their greed, and it was uglier than any public humiliation they could cook up. They were digging a hole for themselves, a pit of public opinion that would eventually swallow them whole. They had wanted me to be useless and broke, and now they were discovering that my money, far from being a weakness, was my greatest strength, and I was just getting started. The charity gala was a sea of sparkling gowns and polite smiles, a world I had once navigated with quiet ease. But tonight, it felt different. I was no longer a ghost in the crowd, a grieving widow with a passive smile. I was the guest of honor, being celebrated for the donations that Marcus and Sarah had so desperately tried to spin as my downfall. My arm, now completely healed, was a forgotten ache. The only thing that remained was the quiet, cold resolve that had replaced my grief. I was a woman who had been broken, and in the breaking, I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. I had come alone. Clara had offered to come with me, but I had politely declined. This was a battle I had to fight on my own. My other daughter, Anna, had called from abroad, her voice full of pride and a fierce, quiet support. My nephew, Tom, had sent me a text, a simple thumbs-up emoji that spoke volumes. I was not alone, but I was on my own, and in the difference between those two things I had found my power. When they called me to the podium, a hush fell over the room. I stood before the crowd, my heart a steady, silent drumbeat against my ribs. I looked out at the faces, some familiar, some strangers, and I knew what they were expecting. A tearful speech about my late husband, a gracious thank you for their kindness. I had a speech prepared, but in that moment, I threw it away. I didn't need to speak about George. I needed to speak about myself. I began to speak, my voice quiet but firm, carrying over the silent crowd. I spoke of the importance of valuing people over possessions, a phrase that felt both personal and universal. I spoke of how easy it is to lose oneself in the pursuit of wealth, to mistake material gain for happiness. I didn't mention Marcus or Sarah by name. I didn't need to. The subtext was a sharp, silent blade, and I could see it land on the faces of people who knew my story. They saw the truth in my words, the raw, unfiltered honesty of a woman who had lost everything and found herself in the process. I felt a new sense of freedom, a lightness that was 1,000 times more valuable than any money they could have stolen. My wealth was no longer a chain holding me captive to my son's greed. It was a tool, a weapon I could wield for good. I had been a woman with a broken heart, but tonight, I was a woman with a purpose. I had been a gentle woman, but tonight, I was a force to be reckoned with. And as I stepped down from the podium, I knew that my quiet revenge was a roar that would be heard for a long, long time. The charity gala was a turning point, a public declaration of my newfound resolve. Marcus and Sarah were undoubtedly seething, but I was beyond caring. Their opinions, their pathetic attempts at public shaming, meant nothing to me anymore. My world had narrowed to a single sharp point, making them understand the true cost of their greed. My quiet revenge was no longer a secret. It was a promise I had made to myself, and I intended to keep it. The next day, I met with my attorney, Mr. Albright, in a quiet, secluded cafe far from the prying eyes of the community. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and the low hum of conversation, a stark contrast to the charged silence of my old study. I laid out my final plan, my voice low but unwavering. I want to transfer the bulk of my remaining personal wealth into a new foundation, I said, watching his face for any sign of doubt. A foundation for women's causes, for shelters, for legal aid, for women who have been used and discarded by the very people they loved. He didn't hesitate. He knew my story, and he had seen the cold, hard resolve in my eyes. "It's a noble cause, Evelyn," he said, his voice full of respect, "but it will leave you with very little. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I simply nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said, a small, genuine smile on my lips. "They wanted my money, John. They can have a foundation in my name, a legacy for a cause I truly believe in. The rest, they can live without." He nodded, a look of profound understanding on his face. He knew that this wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming my narrative, about turning their betrayal into my triumph. While I was secretly building my new legacy, Marcus and Sarah were frantically plotting their next move. They had seen my public display of strength, and they were terrified. My donations had made it clear that I was not the weak, grieving widow they had counted on. They were convinced that I was cornered, that I was squandering their inheritance, and they believed they had a way to stop me. They called a family meeting under the guise of an apology, a pathetic attempt to publicly coerce me into changing my will, into giving them back what they believed was theirs. The invitation was sent through a mutual friend, a distant cousin who was blissfully unaware of the true nature of their greed. The message was saccharine and insincere, full of false remorse and promises of reconciliation. But I saw through it. I knew what this was, a trap. They were desperate, and they were going to play their last card. But they didn't know that I had already played mine. They didn't know that my quiet revenge was not just about taking away their money, but about taking away their power. They had wanted me to be a victim, but I was about to walk into that family meeting as a victor, and I was going to do it with a smile. They had wanted to make me broke and useless, but they were about to discover that being alone is better than being used, and that quiet doesn't mean weak. It just means you're waiting. The air in the living room felt thick and suffocating, heavy with the weight of unspoken resentments and false pleasantries. I had arrived at my old home, the place they had ransacked, the place they now occupied with a sense of ill-gotten triumph for the so-called family meeting. Marcus and Sarah sat on the couch, a perfectly rehearsed picture of remorse, but their eyes, darting between me and the clock, betrayed their desperation. They thought they had me, that they could use a public apology to force my hand and reclaim their stolen future. They thought I was a broken, useless woman they could manipulate with a few well-placed tears. They had no idea that I had just brought an army with me. I sat in the armchair opposite them, the same one where I had sat with George 1,000 times, and the familiarity was a cold comfort. I didn't say a word. I just watched them, my silence a weapon they couldn't anticipate. Marcus began with a theatrical sigh, his voice thick with a fake sincerity. "Mom, we are so sorry," he started, his words a carefully constructed performance of a son begging for forgiveness. "We've been so lost since Dad passed. We made mistakes. We were grieving, and we lashed out. We know we hurt you, and we're here to make things right." Sarah, ever the dutiful wife, chimed in, her eyes welling up with what I knew were crocodile tears. "We just want our family back, Evelyn. We want to be a family again. We're willing to do anything to make things right." They were talking in circles, their words a web of lies meant to ensnare me. They were getting to the part where they would ask me to change my will, to unfreeze their assets, to give them a second chance to ruin me. But I didn't give them the chance to finish. I calmly reached into my bag and placed a large, thick manila envelope on the coffee table between us. The sound it made as it hit the polished wood was a quiet, final statement. I didn't open it. I just pushed it toward them, my gaze steady on their faces. "Before we talk about making things right," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "I think you should read this." Marcus, his face a mixture of confusion and irritation, opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the documents, and a look of sheer, unadulterated horror spread across his face. Sarah, leaning over his shoulder, gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Inside the envelope were legal documents, a clear and undeniable record of my actions. There was a bill of sale, showing that the house they were sitting in, the house they had ransacked and believed was their birthright, had been quietly sold. Attached to it was a legal notice for them to vacate the property within 30 days. They had wanted a family meeting, a public display of contrition. I had given them a legal reality check. The house, which my husband had quietly put into my name years ago to protect me, was no longer a symbol of their entitlement. It was an asset I had liquidated, a final, silent act of revenge. They had wanted to take away my home, and in a single, decisive action I had taken theirs. The silence that followed was a living, breathing thing. It stretched between us, thick with the unsaid, punctuated by the rustle of the legal papers in Marcus's trembling hands. His face, once a mask of feigned remorse, was now a portrait of pure, unadulterated rage. Sarah's tears, which had been so readily available moments before, had dried up, leaving behind a cold, hard glare. They stared at the documents, at the signatures, at the undeniable proof of their defeat. They had come to me to demand, to coerce, to manipulate. And I had simply taken away their home. Marcus was the first to speak. His voice, when it came, was a low growl of disbelief. You can't do this," he stammered, his eyes wide with shock. "This is our family home. It's our inheritance. It's my birthright." His words were a roadmap of his entitlement, a desperate cry of a man who had just realized his world was crumbling around him. "Your birthright was your kindness," I said, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering. "Your birthright was your mother's love. Your birthright was a home that was full of respect and trust. You chose to squander all of it." My words were a match to his tinder. He exploded. The carefully constructed facade of the remorseful son fell away completely, revealing the monster underneath. "You cruel, heartless monster!" he shrieked, jumping to his feet. "You're doing this out of spite. You're destroying our lives because you're a bitter, pathetic old woman who has nothing better to do." He was a child having a tantrum, his face red with fury, his hands clenched into fists. Sarah, ever the opportunist, joined in. Her voice was shrill, laced with venom. "We were just trying to take care of you. We were trying to help you. You're the one who's destroying this family, Evelyn. You're the one who is going to be alone." She was trying to turn the tables, to make me the villain in her sad, sordid story, but her words had no power over me anymore. I had learned what it meant to be alone. I had learned that being alone is better than being used. I simply stood up. My movements were slow, deliberate, and final. I looked Marcus directly in the eye, and then I looked at Sarah. There was no anger in my gaze, just a profound, chilling pity. "You chose this path," I said, my voice a quiet, final statement. "You chose to break a glass door. You chose to steal from your own mother. You chose to ransack a home that you believed was yours. I didn't destroy your lives. I merely made sure I wouldn't follow you down the path you had chosen. You only miss me now that I've said no, but the truth is, you never loved me at all. You just loved my money. And now, you have neither." I turned and walked away, leaving them in the ruins of their own making. The confrontation was over. The battle had been won. But the war for my heart had just begun. The door clicked shut behind me, a final, definitive sound that sealed my escape. I left Marcus and Sarah in a state of stunned disbelief, drowning in a sea of their own making. I walked to my car, the same one I had used to arrive, and the sense of freedom was exhilarating. The house was gone, the memories tainted, but my heart was, for the first time in years, truly my own. I started the engine, my mind a storm of quiet satisfaction. My revenge was complete. I had won. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed a second car pulling up to the curb. It was a sleek black sedan I didn't recognize. A woman with a familiar, yet distant face stepped out. She was older, with a regal posture and a shock of silver hair that caught the last light of the setting sun. Her eyes, a sharp, piercing blue, scanned the house and then landed on me. I felt a jolt of recognition. It couldn't be, not after all these years. It was my long-lost, estranged aunt, my mother's sister, Margaret. I got out of my car, a question mark hanging in the air between us. She smiled, a sad, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, Evelyn," she said, her voice a low, melodic purr. "I've been watching." She walked past me, a force of nature, and pushed open the front door. The splintered wood groaned in protest, a fitting sound for the scene that was about to unfold. I followed her inside, my quiet satisfaction replaced by a cold dread. What was she doing here? What had she been watching? I found Marcus and Sarah exactly where I had left them, a pathetic tableau of defeated greed. They looked up, their faces a mixture of fury and despair, and then they saw my aunt. Their expressions turned from rage to a confused, terrified recognition. Margaret stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes a glacial blue that cut through the silence. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Look at what the cat dragged in. You two have been busy, haven't you?" She walked into the living room, her steps slow and deliberate, a queen walking into a den of thieves. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Stealing from my sister, trying to take what isn't yours." Marcus, in a last-ditch effort, tried to rally. "It is ours. This is our inheritance," he shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. Margaret just laughed, a short, sharp sound that was devoid of humor. "Your inheritance? You poor, deluded fools. This inheritance was never Evelyn's to begin with. It was always meant for my side of the family. Your father, George, was just a temporary trustee. He was holding it for me, for my family, until I was ready to take it back." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The inheritance, the money, the house. It was never mine. I had spent years of my life grieving, fighting, and planning revenge for something that was never even mine. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a dizzying sense of disorientation. I had been a pawn in a game I didn't even know existed, But then I looked at my aunt, at the fierce, protective love in her eyes, and I understood. George had protected me. He had made me a temporary trustee, knowing my love for his son would make me vulnerable. He had given me a weapon, and in doing so, he had given me the strength to fight for myself. He had protected me from a betrayal I had never seen coming. The betrayal was real, but the loss, it turned out, was not. The air in the living room crackled with a new, sharper kind of tension. My aunt, Margaret, stood as a pillar of unwavering authority, and in her presence, Marcus and Sarah looked less like furious opportunists and more like pathetic children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. The inheritance they had so desperately coveted, the money they had believed was their birthright, was nothing but a mirage. George, in his infinite wisdom, had made me a temporary trustee, a protector of a legacy that was never mine to begin with. The betrayal was real, but the loss, it turned out, was not. It was a cruel, beautiful irony, a final, protective act from a man who had loved me enough to know the depths of his son's greed. Marcus's face, a mask of entitlement and fury, crumbled. The realization of the true depths of their greed and the years of emotional abuse they had inflicted on me all for nothing seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He collapsed onto the couch, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with a hollow, gut-wrenching sobs. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, was silent, her eyes darting between me and my aunt, her mind undoubtedly racing for a new angle, a new way to salvage her future. But there was nothing left to salvage. They had played their hand, and they had lost everything. My aunt turned to me, her sharp blue eyes softening with a genuine warmth. "I am so sorry, Evelyn," she said, her voice filled with a profound sorrow. "I wanted to come sooner, but I had to be sure." She gestured to the legal documents still on the coffee table, the ones I had used to evict them. I knew George would have a plan. He always did. She took my hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. "You are a stronger woman than I ever gave you credit for." I felt a tear slide down my cheek, not of sadness, but of a profound, humbling gratitude. I was not alone. And in that moment, I understood that the inheritance was not the money, but the love and respect of the people who truly cared for me. My aunt turned back to Marcus and Sarah, her face once again a cold, hard mask. "You have 30 minutes to pack your bags and leave," she said, her voice a final, non-negotiable command. "I have a legal team waiting, and the local authorities are on their way. If you are not gone, you will be escorted out." The threat was clear, and for once, Marcus and Sarah had no fight left in them. They had been exposed, defeated, and humiliated. I watched them, my heart a complex mix of emotions. There was no triumph, no gloating. There was just a profound, quiet sadness for the family I had lost, and a fierce, protective love for the family I had just found. The betrayal had been a painful fire, but in its ashes, a new, stronger Evelyn had been born. I had learned what it meant to be alone, and I had learned that quiet doesn't mean weak, and I was about to learn what it meant to finally, truly, be free. My revenge was not in their downfall, but in my own quiet, powerful rise. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the shattered house and the shattered family behind. The betrayal was real, the pain was deep, but in the end, the truest inheritance wasn't the house or the money. It was the quiet strength that had been forged in the fire of their greed. It was the knowledge that being alone is better than being used, and that quiet doesn't mean weak. It just means you're waiting. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I hope Evelyn's story resonated with you. What was the most impactful moment for you? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched you, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel for more narratives of resilience and revenge. Until next time.